Hi, I'm Tim. Welcome to Watchbox, and thanks for logging on. For that matter, welcome back to Versus. We have a classical matchup, Rolex versus Omega. It is the Rolex Oyster Perpetual Deepsea Sea Dweller versus the Omega Seamaster Planet Ocean. Versus starts now. Let us start with the established power in ultra deep diving watches. Dating back to 1967, the Sea Dweller is a formidable thing, more purposeful and, shall we say, a little bit more raw in its attempt than the versatile Submariner. The Sea Dweller has always been bigger, thicker, more expensive, and more oriented towards the professional diver. Now, while today a professional diver will use a dive computer, there is always the question for bragging rights, which mechanical dive watch represents the most capability, and the Deepsea is Rolex's best attempt at answering that question. The original Deepsea arrived at Baselworld 2008. It was upgraded aesthetically in late 2014 with the arrival of what you see here, the D-Blue dial, inspired by director James Cameron. And then finally in 2018, the Deepsea was redesigned inside and out to look better, fit better, and run longer on a single wind. So this watch is the post-2018 model, the latest available. It's still 44 millimeters in diameter, in 904L steel, and Rolex reminds you that their 904L steel does not need to be rinsed after exposure to seawater. It also remains 17.7 millimeters thick, so it's just as thick as the old Deepsea. The changes externally come in the lug-to-lug span, which is shorter, the end-link to end-link span, which is shorter, and the width of the end-link, which is broader. They've taken some of that width out of the lugs to make them a little bit less squared off and massive, and to have a better proportional balance between the width of the bracelet and the width of the lug. So it is now a 22 millimeter end link rather than 21 before. Inside, the movement's upgraded, many detail changes, but the headline is that it is now a 70-hour power reserve compared to 48 for the old Deepsea. Now we'll throw it on my wrist, which is 16 centimeters in circumference, and you're immediately going to realize that this is a watch that probably shouldn't be worn on a wrist any smaller than mine. If your wrist is smaller than mine, get a Sea Dweller 43 or get a Submariner. It is a formidable thing, and the feel of it on the wrist, it feels indestructible, like a battleship anchor tied to a bank vault. You'll note it'll never fit underneath the cuff, but that's not really the intent. This is a watch that's either going to be worn for a purposeful reason, even if that purpose is simply to show off, but very impressive and comfortable. I do think a 16 centimeter circumference wrist like mine can wear the watch as long as you're okay with a large and loud Rolex on your wrist. Taking a quick look at the bracelet, it's the Oyster bracelet. We talked about the end link, which is now broader, but otherwise not a whole lot of changes here. Satin across the tops, there is some taper to the bracelet, polished outer facing. You can see that removable links are fixed by screws, and then there is a half link built in. This is Rolex's best clasp, or at least certainly its most advanced. There are two locking systems. There's a beacon to hook, and that is a lift lock system. You can see it latch right there, and then you double latch it with the clamshell. There's a little kerf so you can dig your nail in underneath the Rolex coronet, but what really sets this apart, even from the Submariner and the Sea Dweller 43, is that there is a glide lock adjustment system with a trap door. It opens up so you can make the adjustments while the watch is still on your wrist. You can't do that with the other Sea Dweller or the Submariner. You do get the same 20 millimeters of adjustment in 2 millimeter increments, and the reason for this is so you can make those adjustments on your wrist. Remove your dive watch in a deep marine environment and slip, and bye-bye watch. This is designed to ensure the watch stays on your wrist while you're making these adjustments. But in addition to the 20 millimeters of incremental adjustment, you have a fold-out flip lock extension for over 50 millimeters of total adjustment, or if you live in the old British colonies like I do, over 2 inches. It is also a remarkably robust thing. You would not expect, with so many small moving parts, that it would seem just as solid as a standard Oyster clasp on a Submariner, but it does, and the precision of these components with no lateral play, no rattle, no give, just incredible, speaking to the industrial might of Rolex and its relentless attention to detail and getting those details perfect. We talked about the 904L steel, but what might surprise you here is that there's a piece of titanium. The caseback is titanium, and this is the only Rolex watch that has a titanium component. It's rated to 12,800 feet test depth, and then there is a helium escape valve on the side for you saturation divers to let helium out of the watch should it build up in the watch during your dive. But To be honest, 12,800 feet does not accurately describe the resilience of this watch, which ISO 6425 compliant is a true professional dive watch and will have been tested at Rolex to 125% of that rated depth. The crystal is 5.9 millimeters thick, and because of its thickness, it does not have a Cyclops eye magnifier. Rolex probably didn't need to write a book on the dial, but they had so much extra surface area, they decided to do it anyway. Now, important to note here, the structure on which this crystal is mounted, on which original gas escape and ring lock system have been written, that's actually a cylinder that forms the middle part of the ring lock system. It's a cylinder that runs right through the case. It's capped on the top by the sapphire and on the reverse side by the titanium case back, meaning the watch actually becomes more water resistant as water compresses it. Screw down crown, trip lock, no doubt. A bezel that's a little piece of heaven, 120 clicks, a nice sharp knurling that makes it easy to grip, super precise. The click sounds and feels wonderful. The bezel pearl is actually sapphire capped. You line up that bezel pearl with the minute hand. Now you have an impromptu 0 to 60 minute count up timer, ceramic bezel insert for scratch resistance, and the wells are actually filled with platinum. So the indices and the numerals, those are little platinum filled wells to resist discoloration over time. The dial, of course, has that lacquered conversion from dark blue to black that recalls James Cameron, yes, director James Cameron's Rolex-sponsored dive from the surface to the bottom of the Challenger Deep, the deepest part of the ocean in the Marianas Trench. And he actually did so in a submersible of his own that had a color exactly the same as the signal green of the word deep sea on this dial. The hands and the numerals themselves are white gold. And then you've got the little Rolex crown that's slowly rolled out into the collection on every new Rolex launched since 2018, the little crown between Swiss and made. Inside, you've got next generation caliber 3235, hacking, quick set, yes, 70-hour power reserve, anti-magnetic, shock resistant, all important things, but the headline number is you've got that 70-hour power reserve now, and that movement is all Rolex, right down to the shock protection and even the lubricants. So the Planet Ocean originally arrived in 2005. It was redesigned for 2016 when they became master chronometers. That year, for the first time, you could get the three-hand date model, which you see here, in a 43.5 millimeter case. The version you see in my hand arrived in 2019, and it introduced what some call the creamsicle combination, 43.5 millimeters in steel, orange ceramic bezel insert, orange dial details on a white ceramic dial base. So the bezel insert is ceramic and the dial itself is ceramic. And previously on the Planet Ocean, if you got an orange bezel or an orange bezel section, that would have been a rubber insert. Here, the technology from the Platinum Planet Ocean GMT has finally found its way to a standard steel Planet Ocean watch. It is a full ceramic insert. Now, throwing this watch on the wrist, although it's only half a millimeter smaller than the Deepsea, it wears much more compact. So from lug to lug, the measurement is 49 millimeters. The thickness is 16.2, so thinner than the Rolex, but not thin. But it's that 49 millimeter lug to lug span with a pivoted end link. So whereas absolutely across the wrist, the Rolex is 51.7, this is 49, and it does make a difference. The spacing between the lugs is 21. Throw it on the wrist, and you can already see that this watch is a better fit for me. My 16 centimeter circumference wrist has a little bit of clearance on each side, so I would say you could even wear this watch on a smaller wrist, as small as 15 centimeters circumference. I wouldn't go smaller than 16 with the Deepsea. It is not a thin watch, neither one of these watches is, but there are other divers in the Rolex Omega collections that will allow you to wear, if you wish, your diver with a suit. It's very comfortable. And you can see down the barrel, the lugs are nowhere near the edge of my wrist. The bracelet's a nice piece, and it manages to be a 3-link dive design without copying the Rolex Oyster. You can see it's all satin finished with rather ovoid cross sections to the individual links. It feels good. It's got a pivoted end link, so unlike the Rolex with its solid end link, it doesn't extend an additional distance across the wrist. The removable links here are fixed by screws, and then you'll appreciate that Omega continues to improve its diving clasp. There is 9.6 millimeters of push-button incremental adjustment in here, and then you've got a fold-out extension. You're not getting as much adjustment as the Rolex, either overall or incremental, but you are getting plenty of capability for fine-tuning the size and for use over a diving suit. There is a trigger release system as opposed to the lift lock and the clamshell system on the Rolex, and I got to admit I actually prefer this system. It's just a little bit more convenient. We have a shallow shear guard for the crown. The helium escape valve here needs to be opened before it's ready to use. And then we have another bezel with 120 clicks. And you can line it up likewise with the broad arrow minute hand, reminding you that back in 2005, the Planet Ocean was the first series production Omega dive watch family to nod to vintage. That nod and the wink toward vintage ultimately became unnecessary in 2014 with the rollout of the Seamaster 300. So this gets to be a modern dive watch for Omega today. So you got that ceramic bezel insert, you've got the ceramic dial base, you have applique indices and Omega logo with tri-Arabic numerals, 600 meters of water resistance here, and then you've got the caliber 8900, which notably is visible. 60-hour power reserve, coaxial escapement. Rolex's answer to that is their chronometer escapement. They basically achieve the same thing by very different means. Neither one is a conventional Swiss lever. We also have a full balance and a free sprung index here, also features you'll find on the Rolex. The big differentiators, of course, being the silicone hairspring here, which is essentially unlimited in its resistance to magnetism, whereas Rolex uses a niobium zirconium metal hairspring that is very resistant but not amagnetic. This is amagnetic. Another big change that you don't get on the Rolex, you get hacking seconds here, but you get a time zone function, so you can move that hour hand independently, and you can do so without displacing or stopping the minute hand or the seconds hand. This is great for traveling. Other features worth mentioning, well, both of them are bidirectional winders, so they're super smooth and you won't hear the winding at all. Both of them are actually nicely machine finished. Trust me, Rolex finish is getting better over the years, but only this one can actually be seen. So, these two watches, we've compared them. Now, let's contrast them. I'm going to talk about what each watch does best. The Rolex, there's no doubt, name recognition is a Rolex strength. If you want a watch to buy on reputation, to be recognized for the watch on your wrist, if you're looking for status and stature, it's not why I buy a luxury watch, but many people do. This is definitely the blue chip. As good as Omega is, Rolex is better. I'll also say this, it's the one to buy new. This watch new costs $12,900. Used, it costs about $17,500, meaning you can buy this watch, wear it for a year, sell it with 4 years of warranty left, and pocket a few $1,000s in profit. So clearly, the case for buying one of these watches, assuming you can actually get them new, this is the one to buy new. This is a deeper diver. Heck, I'm not going to dive to 3,900 meters or 600 meters, but hey, more is better, and luxury is partly about getting more than you need, so diving advantage Rolex. I'm also going to add that this watch on a diving front has a more elegant implementation of the helium escape valve. Why you should have to unscrew it to activate it or bear its presence marring your case band, I don't know. The Rolex system is both transparent and completely automatic, so advantage there. Deeper diving and better helium valve implementation. 70-hour power reserve, 60-hour power reserve. These movements in practice are comparably durable and comparably accurate, but I will say the Rolex with the extra 10 hours is a lot closer to the now industry standard 3 days than the old standard of around 2 days. So this being a 70-hour movement, advantage Rolex. I'll also say that the bezel, feel, and sound, advantage Rolex. This is just a wonderfully crisp sounding and feeling bezel that's among the best in the industry. Really, only Grand Seiko and oddly enough Cartier can compare for bezel, feel, and sound quality. I'll also mention this clasp. It knocks me dead. The way it works, the way it's built, the total adjustment and the amount of incremental adjustment, better clasp, Rolex. No question, and it's not even close. All right, so let's talk about what the Omega does well. The Omega has far less brand baggage. People might occasionally compliment you, recognizing that it is an Omega Seamaster, or maybe they just like the color, but they're not going to try to immediately size up your net worth, think about robbing you, or ask you what you paid for it. So there's a little bit more anonymity. If you prefer not to have the full-blown Jennifer Lawrence treatment as you walk around in public, this is probably the watch to wear, and that's a better fit for me. It's also a better fit for a smaller wrist, as it's a smaller watch. Despite the half-millimeter difference in size, there's really a world of difference between how these two watches wear. Really, it's the difference between a Planet Ocean and a Seamaster Diver 300 meter, to use the Omega analogy, or between I would say probably between a Sea-Dweller Deepsea and a Sea-Dweller 43, to use the Rolex analogy. This wears more like the Sea-Dweller 43. I'll also say this, the display case back, it is not an artisanally finished movement, but it is a good-looking movement, and I'm glad to be able to see that for which I've paid. It's cool, and it doesn't get old. This is an amagnetic watch. The Rolex is anti-magnetic. This thing is almost entirely immune. You have that time zone function where you can jump the hand independently, which I think is better than the conventional setting system on the Rolex. It's certainly more flexible comfortable for travelers. A 2-barrel movement. Why do you want a 2-barrel movement? Because when fully wound, this watch tends to run a little bit fast. When discharged, it tends to lose a little bit after 24 hours, whereas this watch has a very stable degree of amplitude thanks to the twin barrels. It will not run too fast when fully wound, nor will it lose a ton of amplitude on the balance after 24 hours. So 2 barrels, and that is a better altogether solution. So a 2-barrel movement, amagnetic, and the time zone feature. The case, the strap, the dial, the bezel. Here you have options. There is not basically the binary choice you face with Rolex, where you get the Deepsea Deep Blue James Cameron or you get the standard black dial. There are many different versions of the Planet Ocean in 43 millimeters. You can change the look, different metal, put it on a strap. You can get a factory strap. That's not a problem. This is a watch that offers you a lot more opportunities to customize and tailor and find the one that's best for you. This is also a great used buy. If you have to pay $17,500 for this used or $5,750 for this used, obviously the case has already been made for the Omega on an economic basis. This is a watch that sells new for $6,500. It does not lose a lot of value selling for $5,750, so it's a good watch to buy new. I just think with a 5-year warranty, just like the Rolex, this is probably the one you're going to want to buy used and enjoy as much as you would have had you paid basically 3 times as much to get the Rolex. So, lume. You're going to see this in the lume shot later, but this is just the more spectacular watch. The Rolex is well lumed, and it has a lumed bezel pearl on the bezel, but this watch has a fully lumed bezel, and the minute hand and the bezel pearl are green, whereas the rest is blue, so you can easily read one against the other. So which do I prefer? Well, I like both of these watches, and I would happily wear either one, but if it's my own money, I'm going with the Omega. I like the privacy and the discretion that comes with not wearing a Rolex in public. I like the style options. I would get it just like you see here. I love orange watches, but not everyone does, and that's okay. The Planet Ocean gives you the flexibility to choose. The fit is better on my wrist, which means if your wrist is smaller than mine, the difference between these watches becomes even more pronounced. I like the way it feels. I like the way it looks. I like the fact that there is movement tech, the silicone hairspring, the coaxial escapement, originally designed by George Daniels, the twin mainspring barrels, the time zone hand stepping feature. All of that's cool, plus I can see the movement, which still zings me. I love that. And of course, the price used, the economic advantage, is entirely in favor of the Omega. So guys, let me know which of these 2 watches would you prefer, and which of these 2 watches would you take cost no object. And I'm back with the Planet Ocean and the Deepsea. You can see that the entire bezel of the Planet Ocean is lumed, and on that basis, this is a knockout for the Omega.